Hey guys, Chris here with Drift HQ. We have Marco in the house today. We're going to be installing the new Wisefab kit on his IS300. So a portion of this installation, we are going to be modifying the crossmember to relocate the rack a little further forward. So what we're going to do is support the engine out from the top with the cradle so we can keep the engine in place while removing the engine crossmember. Supported the engine, now we're going to go up in the air so we can unbolt the motor mounts and take the crossmember out of the way. We're going to start off by taking off this brace here. It's just 6 14mm bolts across the bottom. Yeah, these are not some regular old bolts, buddy. These are some special boys. Now that we have the rack free from the rest of it, we are going to unbolt the lower control arms, and then at that point it's just the 4 bolts for the crossmember and then 4 bolts for our motor mounts. Now the 2 lower control arm bolts here are going to be 19mm. There's one bracket here that holds your high pressure power steering hose. There's 2 10mm bolts there, you can get to them from the bottom. Our high pressure power steering hose is free from the crossmember, so we should be good to take this out of the way. Alright, now for the last part, we're just going to remove these 4 17mm nuts on the engine crossmember. We're going to go slowly to make sure that our engine's properly secured, which is also why we put the additional center post on here, as well as the cradle from the top, to make sure the engine doesn't fall out when we remove the crossmember. Isn't that right, Marco?
Yeah, that's right.
Control arms are the only thing kind of in our way right now. So we're just going to go ahead and unbolt our shock bolts on both sides. So that'll give us a little bit more swing since we're going to end up removing these lower control arms anyway. So we just freed the lower control arms from the shocks. Now we can move the lower control arm down out of our way, and then we'll be able to remove the crossmember. Alright, so now that we have the crossmember 90% of the way loose, the only thing that's holding us up right now is our steering shaft. And this kit, because the rack relocation actually comes with an extension for your steering shaft where it connects to the rack. So we're going to go ahead and just unbolt that. It's just one 10mm bolt going right through the U-joint on the steering rack.
You know, Chris is a great guy. He's honest, hardworking, loyal, loving, but he makes mistakes too. So this is actually a 12mm bolt, not a 10mm. Please find it in your heart to forgive him. He's a good guy.
I'm sorry. Here she goes. So here is our engine crossmember. Bring that on over here. That beautiful thing gets welded onto here to relocate our rack further forward.
Yep. The cool thing about this too is that it's actually both sides. So whether you have a right-hand drive setup or a left-hand drive setup, this same plate will work both ways. So also, if you're doing a right-hand drive swap, you can use this as well, just to help instead of sourcing a subframe and yada yada. You can just buy one of these plates.
So if you don't take care of your car like Marco does, your crossmember is going to be covered in a bunch of grease and dirt and stuff. But you want to have a nice clean surface when you start welding and cutting, so I'm going to pressure wash this thing off before he starts going at it. Alright, we removed our center post from underneath the car, and we still have our cradle holding the engine in place, so we checked to make sure that our engine isn't moving. So while Marco is going to be working on modifying the crossmember, I'm going to start removing all the stock suspension components to get our new Wisefab stuff installed. So now what we're going to do is we're going to remove the brake caliper and tie it up in the corner so that we're free to remove our entire knuckle assembly. Then we can transfer all our Wisefab parts over and then install it as one whole assembly instead of trying to install each individual piece on the car. This is a 17mm for the brake caliper, but it might be different for your car because he has the upgraded brakes on this.
Okay, so we printed out some stuff, instructions that came from the good guys over at Wisefab. Basically explaining and dumbing down how to cut this up and make it as simple and easy as possible. They actually provided templates. You can print out, they're to scale. We'll cut these guys out, lay them out where they're supposed to go, make our cutting marks, and then use the sweet old plasma cutter that these guys have to chop it up and get it fitted correctly.
So now I am removing the cotter pin from the outer tie rod, and there's a 17mm castle nut on there we're going to remove, and then a few little taps of the hammer and this thing will release, and then everything else is free. So now we have the complete upright assembly removed, so we're going to separate our upper and lower ball joints here. He already has an angle adapter on here, which we're not going to be using anymore. So now it's easier to show you guys with the actual knuckle outside of the car, and we're going to start assembling all of our new parts onto the knuckle before we install it back into the car. We're going to remove these two main bolts here that hold his current angle kit where your factory ball joint would be bolted up. We're going to unbolt that. So now we remove these two 19mm bolts here from the knuckle so that we have the whole lower control arm completely removed and the ball joint and everything removed. Now we're going to go to removing the upper. We're going to remove this cotter pin, and it'll be a 17mm nut, and then we have to separate our ball joint. Like that. Yeah. So now we have our bare knuckle, and we can start bolting all of our cool Wisefab stuff up to our knuckle. Might throw a little paint on this thing just to make it look pretty, because, you know, he doesn't take care of his stuff.
So, per instructions, first thing we're going to do is chop these little guys off, and then we'll start laying out our templates, drawing our cut lines, breaking out the plasma cutter, and this thing fitted up. Very important, always wear safety equipment, glasses. Probably should get some thick gloves just in case. That's about it. As you guys see on the stock setup, upper control arm comes from the top and bolts down. Very common issue on these cars is when they are lowered or they have like extreme, you know, shock clearance. They will hit the top of the shock tower, or the bottom of the shock tower, I should say. What's cool about the Wisefab control arms is they come from the bottom, bolt in, and give you all the clearance that you'll need.
So we cleaned up and painted our knuckle a little bit just to prevent any kind of surface rust or anything from happening. Now this is the piece here that will be our roll center corrector, as well as the bolt mount for our lower control arm and our tie rod. So this piece here bolts in with these two bolts that we're going to put a little bit of thread locker on, as well as the two bolts that will pass through here that also hold the caliper into place. Put a little thread locker on there. Then these two go into the same two bolt holes for the lower section that we removed earlier. And then it is a 10mm Allen bolt. And when you tighten those bolts, you just want to make sure that you don't have a gap here like that. And so there's a little tapering ring in there that will actually center this bolt. So it's going to take a little bit more to get that sitting where we want it. Now that we're sitting nice and flush there, you can see our two caliper bolts there are now lined up. We are going to have to hone this out just a little bit to get it to align because we are running larger brakes on this car. But we're going to deal with that once we actually get the caliper in line. So now the next step, we're going to bolt up the upper control arm. So this is our new upper control arm. It's going to go through this hole and up from the bottom, and that gives us more clearance on the top of our wheel well, because the stock upper control arms, once you start getting too low, they will actually hit the lower portion of your strut tower. These nuts here will be a 24. Wisefab stuff.
All right, we're over here in the fab area at Drift HQ. We've set our templates out, drawn our lines. We're basically going to be cutting out all the hashed out section on the bottom and top of the subframe. We're going to use the trusty plasma torch, get that big section cut out, and then take it from there.
Alright, so now that we have everything mocked up and our lower control arm and everything situated, while we're waiting for him to finish up the crossmember, what we're going to do is take our upper control arm off of the knuckle. Because this is such a tight fit inside the chassis, we're going to install this into the body first instead of trying to maneuver all the weight of this and the lower control arm into place before we put it in. So what I usually do for these is if you take your screwdriver and you just bend these in a little bit, like that. Now that you have these tilted in an inward angle, it makes it easier to install because there's a small lip on the outer portion of the wheel well right there that gets caught on. So now with your ball joint facing upwards, you can slide this right up in there. All right, now you take your original two 14mm bolts. One.
Macro, explain what happened.
Well, first we had lunch. That was real good. And then, I don't know, next thing you know, I was just snipping away, making everything fit, but it's getting close. Basically got the rough cut completed, and then now I have to just break out the grinder, fine tune some edges, and get as close as we can so that way the welds are as good as we can make them.
So our new kit came with solid rack bushings as well for when we do our rack relocation. So these ones are just rubber sleeves with a metal insert, and if you just take a little socket and a hammer, you can actually just knock the old ones out and tap the new aluminum ones in. Slide right in there. Perfect. So this bushing here is the other one that bolts to the cross member to hold the rack into place. This bushing, just a rubber one, comes out pretty easily. And then this one here, you'll slide it over your rack, has a split in the bottom, and then you slide this right over top of it and bolt it into place. And it's basically a solid plastic bushing. I think it's Delrin bushing.
All right, guys, we have our Wisefab rack relocation plate fitted. A little bit of massaging, but thanks to the templates, we were able to get it as close as possible in the first cut, and then just a little bit of extra here and there in certain spots to get it to fit as nice as we can. That way we can lay a nice quality weld down. What's also cool about this is that they include these spacers as well as these eccentric washers to make sure that your plate is lined up exactly where it needs to be. That way it takes all the guesswork out of this kit basically. You get it to fit, put these washers in, snug them down, and then you can start tacking and then welding your product. We're all welded up. Going to lay a little bit of paint on it, just make sure no rust issues in the future. And then we're going to let it dry and get it installed and put the rest of the kit together.
All right, so Marco has just finished welding all of our adapter plate here to relocate our rack. Now we can put our steering rack and crossmember back into place, bolt back up our motor mounts, and start assembling the actual control arms. So rack's been installed. Now that we have it hard mounted, we can change our inner tie rods. So now it's easier just to break those loose from the inner. So we're going to cut the straps on the inner tie rod. Boot. All right, so now that we have the rack relocated, we installed our new inner tie rods, which are a little bit longer than the factories to compensate for the Wisefab kit. And we also have installed our steering rack adapter, which spaces this out to keep our steering shaft long enough for the rack relocate. So now that we have the upper control arm installed in the car, we're going to install lower control arm to our knuckle before we put it in. So now we're going to take this and we can hang it up through our upper control arm. Now we secure the nut on the top, make sure that the taper actually sits inside of the cup for the upper ball joint. That's going to be a 24mm. Now on the lower control arm, you have a cup here, which is going to sit over top of the sleeve here on the factory chassis. And then our lower control arm bolt that came with the kit, along with the eccentric lockout, is going to go through our lower control arm there. Our new bolt for the lower control arm is going to thread into the piece that was welded into our steering rack relocation, and that's going to be a 22 millimeter. So now we're going to lift our lower control arm into place, and we're going to reuse our factory shock bolt to mount the shock to the lower control arm. And that's going to be a 17 millimeter on both sides, the bolt and the nut. And this gives you 3 different positions to mount the shock to change the ratio that the shock's going to travel as the suspension moves. Now with this kit, you can actually reuse your factory sway bar end length. The longer portion is going to go through your lower control arm. That's a 19 millimeter nut. And the upper here is a 17 millimeter nut.
All right, so we're about to install the tie rod pickup onto the knuckle. And what's cool about the Wisefab stuff is that they have these little washers that let you adjust your Ackerman basically on the fly. And they'll have different adjustments based on which washer it is and then which direction you place it in as well. Whether it's towards the outside of the car or the inside of the car will make a positive or negative adjustment. So it's basically like a neutral setting, a little bit more Ackerman, and then a ton of Ackerman. So just basically makes it adaptable to each driver and how they want to set their car up. So all you do is change the washer top and bottom. So on this one, we're going to do the 2-point, which is a 3 mil positive Ackerman because it's towards the outside of the vehicle. Put it in here where it goes into place. Get the matching washer for up top. Put the tie rod in, tighten the bolt, and it's good to go. What's also cool about the Wisefab angle kit is that it's definitely a track-oriented setup. Here they have bump stops that you can adjust on the fly, that you can basically fine-tune how much angle you get to with this kit. I believe this kit gets up to 65 degrees of angle, which is pretty nutty, but still gives you the ability to fine-tune it to where you need. So basically you will move this spacer, which is offset. So the more you spin it, the higher number that you get out will adjust your angle, and then to take away from it, you'd spin it in, and then simply tighten the bolt. And there you go from there.
So we have an adjustment point here for our caster. The top arm here has the double adjusters to adjust camber and caster, and then our lower control arm here has the caster as well. So you put a 10 millimeter Allen key in here and you can actually see how much movement you can get out of adjusting these. Makes it easier to align the car while it's on the rack instead of having to remove control arms to make adjustments. Alright, so now to put the stock brace back on, it does come with supplied bolts and some spacers here, because with our new lower control arms, this is a little bit taller than factory. So the new bolts come with the adjuster here, and then these bolts here come for the spacer, so when it all gets tightened up.
Alrighty guys, we're all wrapped up installing our Wisefab IS300 kit. We're going to slam the brakes back on, nut and bolt everything, make sure everything's tight and ready to go. I would definitely recommend, as far as the rack relocation kit, definitely recommend getting that done at a fab shop if you don't know how to fab yourself. It's not insanely hard, but it's definitely a meticulous job, and you want the weld to be quality and you want someone to know what they're doing. So definitely recommend that. But as far as the kit itself, it's really straightforward and you can definitely get it done at home. So everything we did on this side, it's basically a mirror image on the other side as well. So after we're done checking everything, buttoning everything up, getting the car ready, and looking forward to hitting the track as soon as possible. Thank you for watching.
He did great.